So today we will have the chance to kind of set also grounds on what heterodox and mainstream ways of reasoning in economics are, which kind of feeds in a lot in the discussion that we have been having in this series. We have the chance of having someone who knows quite well, because Anders wrote his thesis, his PhD thesis about the topic. So we asked him a bit for mission impossible of summarizing in 40 minutes your PhD thesis. But I think we are quite lucky, so we can start. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I'll see if I can start with a screen share after our small technical interruption here in the beginning. So, can you see the screen on Zoom? Excellent, thank you. So, I will talk today about some parts of my PhD thesis, and in this talk that I've titled Styles of Reasoning in Mainstream and Heterodox Economics. Let's see. I will start out framing this study with an older joke that may be familiar to some of you. The joke goes like this. An economist, a physicist, and a chemist are stranded on a desert island with nothing to eat. Then all of a sudden, a can of soup washes ashore, but they have nothing to open it with. So the physicist says, hey, let's climb that palm tree and drop the can until it breaks. But the chemist says, no, let's make a fire and heat the can until it bursts. The economist goes, no, guys, you're both wrong. Let's assume a can opener. His old joke is, of course, funny because we recognize something about the different ways of thinking and the different ways of approaching the world that comes with different disciplines in science. And this is quite related to what I will talk about today. So, as I mentioned already, this talk is based on my PhD dissertation in sociology, disciplined reasoning, styles of reasoning, and the mainstream heterodoxy divide in Swedish economics. So it's a dissertation in sociology, sociology of knowledge, or sociology of science, to be more specific. With the broad question, you can say, why do economists think the way they do? Or more specifically, how has a common approach to science, which is often called the mainstream in economics, become stabilized in the modern economics discipline? And how is that related to the heterodox economics? And the background to this thesis and this problem is the increasing discussions about this notion of mainstream economics and heterodox economics in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. On the one hand, we have had a situation that many have described, and it has some similarities to a classical Kuhnian paradigm. So we know that economics is among one of the most influential social science disciplines with a great societal influence. And economics also show a strong consensus on theoretical and methodological matters within the mainstream. So resembling a Kuhnian paradigm. Other scholars have, for example, discussed the hierarchical orientation of economics towards the disciplinary elite or the top, and the sense of superiority, as Marion Fourcade and others have highlighted. But a classical Kuhnian paradigm means that there is no alternative in science. There is only one approach that allows you to formulate questions and solve them and so on. The Kuhnian theory of paradigm doesn't allow that there are contending paradigms. That only happens, according to Kuhn, in scientific revolutions when you have a paradigm shift. And another way to approach this would be as a scientific controversy, which is a pet topic in sociology of science or science and technology studies. We basically have a scholars disagreeing, scholars with the same background, same research field and so on, they come into disagreement on a very specific matter, which often are resolved by one side winning and establishing the new truth. And there are plenty of examples of that in the history of science. And signs pointing in this direction is the increasing attention given to economics following the 2008 crisis. I won't go into details here, and I think you're quite familiar with it. I'll just mention the increasing public debate in newspapers and other media following the crisis. The rise of activism among students, the formation of new students groups. We had starting basically with Occupy Wall Street, we had student groups starting to discuss reform of economics education, and we had student groups in 2013, 14, 15 forming around the world, and international networks. Some famous open letters, for example, arguing about the mainstream economics being too disciplinary narrow, and students arguing for more intellectual interdisciplinary pluralism. But we have also seen a prelude to that development with increasing calls within the profession of economics for pluralism and reorientation of the discipline, at least since the early 1990s. And specifically in the late 1990s, we saw the growth of what I call here the heterodox movement, and which is the term these scholars also use themselves. So the term heterodoxy is more than 100 years old, and apparently it was used by Thorstein Veblen and the old American institutionalists sometimes. And from the 1930s onwards, it was sometimes used to describe basically old American institutionalism. Then in the 80s, 90s, it started increasingly to be used also to denote Marxist and post-Keynesians that saw that we have something here together that is an alternative approach to doing economic research that is not neoclassical mainstream economics. So this led in the 1990s to the increasing use of the term heterodoxy to unite everyone who thought that we are doing something else that is not mainstream economics. So there was this formation of intellectual and social camps with professional organizations, journals, conferences, newsletters, and so on. So you can illustrate this here with a Google Ngrams viewer. We see, yeah, you can see here around 2008, it's heavily peaking the concept, the phrase heterodox economics, and continuing onwards after that. So just a quick view of the data I have been using for this for the thesis. I will cover it a little bit today. I will give some empirical examples, but I will mainly be focusing on the theoretical concept of styles of reasoning. So the thesis draws on a review of debates among historians of economic thought and heterodox economists. Following this development around the turn of the millennium. So this increasing discussion that there is a group of scholars seeing themselves as heterodox opposed to something called the mainstream, it spurred the scholarly debates about, okay, what is this mainstream and what is neoclassical economics that people talk about, and then what is heterodoxy or orthodoxy and so on. I also did interviews with economists at the top 5 universities in Sweden. So that's Lund, Uppsala, Gothenburg, Stockholm University, and Stockholm School of Economics, where I selected a sample including both newcomers to the discipline that are becoming socialized into the discipline, so PhD students, mid-career researchers, but also made sure to have some of the very disciplinary elites, so some of the highest cited scholars, people who had served in the Nobel Committee, etc. Also, professors responsible for PhD programs, for example, at these influential departments. And also part of the sample were by heterodox economists. So these heterodox economists were then people who had identified publicly as heterodox or engaged in public debates on the sides of heterodoxy, or snowballing, so people identified by others as prominent heterodox economists. I should say that when I started this project, I had the idea that this would be a study of mainstream and heterodox economics as two similar groups that I would devote similar attention to. But I found out that people who identified as heterodox economists in Sweden are very few, and it was very hard to find those informants. That's an interesting finding in itself, I think. The third form of data I used was expert evaluation reports from the hiring of full professors collected from during 25 years at 4 of these top universities. Stockholm School of Economics is a private university, so they're not covered by the Freedom of Information Act. So they wouldn't respond to, or they responded negatively to my request to take part of the evaluation reports. The last part I will not cover very much today. So let's turn to the debates on the nature of mainstream and heterodox economics. So this is a selected review of the debates that took place from around the turn of the century and during roughly 15 years onwards about these interrelated questions, but basically some sort of conceptual delimitations. What are we talking about when we're talking about these groups? And to make this as a very quick recap, these authors are engaged on different sides of the debate. Heterodox economists tend to portray the economics mainstream as neoclassical and very stable and very rigid and unchanging. And of course, they are presenting a view of heterodox economics as opposed to that. While other scholars like John B. Davis and David Colander have a more maybe nuanced view, or they try to see also to the change in the mainstream economics and talk about the changes over time and the sort of relative heterogeneity in the discipline. I try to look beyond these substantial disagreements on conceptualization and development over time, and found that these authors converge on basically 3 aspects of what mainstream economics and heterodox economics is. And the first one is that the disciplinary mainstream is based on a set of ontological assumptions. So basically, assumptions about the parts of reality that this discipline studies. And a way of formulating these 3 meta-axioms, as you can call them, so very basic underlying assumptions about what we study in social reality. This first, methodological individualism, so the idea that individual actors are the unit of analysis rather than, for example, social relations or social groups, something like that. The second one is methodological instrumentalism, so the idea that actors are driven by instrumental rationality. For example, for me as a sociologist, it's very obvious that we also think about other types of rationality or motives or meaning as drivers of human behavior. The third is some form of relation to equilibrium, either an assumption about states of equilibrium or discussions relying on some sort of equilibrium analysis. The second aspect found in these debates among these authors is an epistemological, so basically how do we gain certain knowledge, where there is a strong convergence on the role of formal modeling and the use of econometrics or statistics in economics. The third one is of a different kind. It's a more sociological aspect, which is noted by some of these authors, especially John B. Davis, who draws on some sociology of science. It is just to understand these divides. It's not only an intellectual divide, but it's also a question of social professional groupings. So we have thought collectives and actors engaging in boundary work, so constructing boundaries against other disciplines, against non-science, etc. And the conclusion about heterodoxy is basically, as a minimal conclusion, that heterodoxy doesn't have any similar strong uniting assumptions. The main uniting assumption is the critique of the assumptions of mainstream economics. So it's a different social collective that distances or draws boundaries towards the mainstream economics, and also strongly based on rejection of some of the ontological or epistemological assumptions of the mainstream. So I will dig a little bit into styles of reasoning as a concept and as a theory. So my idea here to focus quite heavily on the conceptual aspect of the thesis and in this presentation is that I think I hope that the concept of styles of reasoning can be a useful thinking tool to make sense of this kind of intellectual structures, division, possibilities and problems in interdisciplinary collaboration, etc. And also, of course, in relation to economic history. I should have mentioned that before. So this thesis and this presentation isn't so much about economic history as a discipline. It's of course about economics, although it's quite relevant because both some heterodox economists have a natural home in economic history, and many internationally would probably consider a lot of economic history a kind of heterodox economics. But also because I hope that this discussion about economics and its boundaries and this debate about mainstream and heterodox economics and making sense of that with the styles concept can perhaps be useful for stimulating thought and discussion about economic history as a discipline. So the idea of styles of thinking, so that is an idea that there are socially shared and reproduced structures of thought and thinking, was introduced in German sociology by Karl Mannheim, so he's considered the father of the sociology of knowledge in the 1920s. And it immediately became very popular and influential in the German-speaking world. The concept of styles originally came from art history and art historians trying to make sense of periods and periodizations in art history. We have a concept of style that is something quite intangible and hard to define, but you can nevertheless delimit periods or styles of an epoch, for example. So this is the original inspiration of the styles concept. Ludwig Fleck was a Polish-Jewish medical doctor who did history of science, history of medicine, basically as a hobby. And he wrote a remarkable little book in the 1930s on the history of the concept of syphilis, which drew on Karl Mannheim's concept of styles of thinking. And he also added a very sociological idea of thought collectives, so that styles of thinking are linked to social groups who somehow reproduce and keep these thoughts alive over history. Ludwig Fleck was very forgotten. I think his book was printed in something like 200 copies, and it never reached outside sort of a review in medical journals until Thomas Kuhn, by a chance, found a copy in a library in the US. And he has an account of how his encounter with Ludwig Fleck's book was one of the most important impetuses for his writing of the structure of scientific revolutions. And there are some similarities here. I will come back to that, between the idea of styles of reasoning and Kuhnian paradigm theory. After that, the concept hasn't been used very much until a historian of science, Alistair Crombie, started working on it in the 70s, apparently in much contact with Ian Hacking, the philosopher of science. Alistair Crombie wrote a massive volume on the history of Western science during like 2.5 millennia, where he argues that during this history of science, there are 6 distinct styles of reasoning that all Western science rely on, and in different ways. However, Ian Hacking picked up this idea. As a philosopher, he turned this like massive 1,600-page book by Crombie into a nice little paper and published that before Crombie. So the styles concept was developed by Crombie, but has been made popularized by Ian Hacking. So the idea here is that these styles of reasoning represent general commitments and dispositions, in the words of Crombie, that establish, prior to any research made, the knowable and legitimate ways of finding out the ontological and epistemological assumptions and ideals of science. And Crombie says furthermore that the styles establish in advance of any particular research the kinds of argument, evidence, and explanation that will give satisfaction because the supposedly discoverable have been discovered in conformity with the acceptable criteria. So this is a very similar notion to the Kuhnian theory of paradigms, that you have sort of a structure of what counts as a valid domain of the world to investigate, what counts as valid methods of finding out, before discussions of so particular methods or data and so on. So Crombie identified that, so in his very grand history narrative of Western science, he identified that there are at least 6 different styles of reasoning. So these styles are, with some classical examples here, what he calls the deductive style. So arguing from premises to conclusions. The classical example is the Euclidean geometry, which formed a paradigm as a textbook for almost two millennia. Another style is the experimental style pioneered by Galileo, and of course very well known today. Third style is what he calls hypothetical modeling, pioneered in antiquity by astronomy, and something used, for example, in modern economics today. So creating some sort of model of the world with elements that you can somehow manipulate to know something about the outcomes. A fourth style is the taxonomic or classificatory style, which Carl Linnaeus is a good example of. It's basically the categorizing, sorting, classifying the world into groups, concept types, whatever. The fifth style is the statistical or the probabilistic style, which is more recent and has really only taken off during the last 150 to 200 years after the probabilistic revolution. And the last one is what we could call the historical evolutionary, which is exemplified by Darwin, which is about studying evolutionary developments through time. And both Crombie and Hacking, they emphasize that this is a list based primarily on studies of natural science, which is non-exhaustive. Someone else may come up with a new style. And I think looking at the social sciences, that there are ample room for discovering or identifying other styles than these. So some words about styles of reasoning. Compared to Kuhnian paradigms, styles of reasoning are thought to be more foundational. So a style of reasoning like the use of statistics is of course not only used within one discipline, but it's something that is shared by many disciplines. The styles are also thought to be combined in different ways in different disciplines. At a specific point in time in a specific field, draws on some styles, but not all of them. And that's of course what we as historians or sociologists and so can study. How is a specific field or a discipline using different styles? And compared to the Kuhnian view of history, which thinks about science as sort of constancy marked by abrupt revolutions, which has been somewhat discredited after Kuhn. This is a more of an evolutionary view where you can see gradual changes in the mixes of styles of reasoning. Ian Hacking adds that styles are what he calls self-authenticating and potentially incommensurable with each other. So Kuhn has this idea that paradigms are incommensurable, so you can't compare the Newtonian physics with Einsteinian physics, for example. It doesn't make sense. You need to be in one of the worlds, as Kuhn says, to sort of communicate between them. And Hacking has a similar argument here about styles being potentially incommensurable. And he says that the style in our list, they don't answer to any criteria of truthfulness other than their own. They are not chosen because they work. Instead, they help determine what counts as working. So this means that there are within a style of reasoning, there are rational grounds to close debates and come up with solutions, etc. But Hacking argues that there are no such rational grounds outside the style. So, for example, choosing which style should be used. So that opens up for other social explanations of why a specific combination of styles is used. A recent and very nice study by the historian and philosopher of economics Mary S. Morgan at LSE is The World in the Model, where she shows how this concept of styles of reasoning can be brought down from this grand historical narratives to nice detailed case studies. So she has different case studies of how styles of reasoning guide thinking and doing, so working with the models in economics. And she points to the central role of specifically the modeling style in modern economics, but also how these styles of reasoning are enmeshed with each other, and specifically the deductive, the statistical, and later experimental style in economics. However, Morgan's study is mostly has to do with the intellectual work with the models and other styles. And there's less focus on the social context that I'm interested in as a sociologist, and the actors and institutions that reproduce or transform styles at the collective level. So the theoretical contribution that I make in this thesis is to synthesize the concept of styles with sociological theorizing. So first of all, thinking about how a social structure like a style can't exist without actors that reproduce it. And this can be made sense of through Pierre Bourdieu's concept of scientific habitus. So basically, habitus means the embodied dispositions and judgment that actors, researchers acquire through training and practice in specific fields. So being trained in a scientific field makes that you get a sense and embodied sense of judgment for what good quality is, for example. Second, I draw on the concept of boundary work and think of styles as relational. So if you have one way of doing things, it will always be contrasted with an outside something that is not it, something that is not good science, for example. Boundary work is a very much used concept in the sociology of science, where it's both used to show how scientists create boundaries between science and non-science, but also between different disciplines. And boundary work is both rhetorical, so you have create like ideas and notions of who belongs and who doesn't belong, what way of doing things does and doesn't. But it also becomes real and gets real consequences, for example, in academic hiring and quality evaluations. The third aspect is institutions. So thinking about these like abstract styles of reasoning in an institutional setting of the disciplines of the modern university. And here I draw on American sociologist Andrew Abbott, who talks about disciplines and as self-stabilizing institutions that work mainly through standardized PhD trainings, hiring of disciplinary PhD, who then sort of reproduce the discipline, and the discipline also as universally recognizable units of research and training. And economics is, of course, a classical example of such a discipline. So I will give some brief examples from my interviews here. So I did 20 interviews with Swedish economics, as already mentioned. About a third of this sample was heterodox economists. And a very brutal summary of some of the interview findings, that there is many informants showed a very intuitive sense of talking about what proper rigorous science is, which I interpret in terms of this scientific habitus. It's also evident both from senior professors and those responsible for PhD programs that the very highly standardized graduate programs is a very conscious strategy of creating unity in the discipline. It's also evident from PhD students that I talked about. So this is an institutional way of socialization or habitus formation that happens in scientific disciplines.
What do you mean with standards? Standards between the different universities?
Yeah, exactly. So I had a question from the audience. I'm not sure the audience is heard on Zoom because we had this microphone problem. But Jonas had this question, what is meant by standardized graduate programs. So it basically means that the same course modules and to a large extent similar literature is used not only across departments in Sweden, but as many informants were eager to highlight, also internationally. And yeah, I will show an example in the quote here in a minute. So we also have a very strong notion of this theoretical and methodological core of the discipline that the review of the debates mentioned before also covered. So there's idea, this idea that there is a theoretical and methodological core, and this is something important and valuable for the discipline, which makes the discipline very productive. In line with the previous research, also a strong orientation towards this core and towards the disciplinary elite, top journals, etc. And the construction of this disciplinary identity and talk about this disciplinary style was often done in stark contrasting. I should say that when I started these interviews, I anticipated finding something like this, but not as much as I actually did. So casually talking about what economics is without explicitly being questioned about other disciplines often led to contrasting with other disciplines, or to talking about heterodox economics. And I was also surprised that many, especially younger economists, had no idea of this notion of heterodox economics or had no exposure to something like that. Sometimes the existence of heterodox economics was even denied. And many economists, they talked about a collective sense that they are hated by the outside. So one informant talked about the hatred of economics, so that there are people out there who actively hate economics and that we are sort of targeted somehow. So not a very nice feeling. The few heterodox economists I interviewed seem to all have broader formative experiences, more exposure that seemed important to, and interest in philosophy of science, history of economic thought, and also to politics or political movements. They also had several accounts of exclusion experiences. And we also saw that the heterodox informants, thank you, heterodox informants, and this is not like black and white, that there's mainstream economists and heterodox economists. We have also some people in a gray zone who agree a little bit here and there, of course. Reject some elements of the disciplinary style and, for example, propose alternative approaches. So someone may, for example, discuss how hard it is to propose a project using qualitative interviews in economics, as an example. We also see that there is, as also known from the literature, that there seems to be a changing disciplinary style with increasing emphasis, of course, on econometrics on behalf of the pure theorizing. This is especially evident when you talk to older professors and younger economists. The older generation was much more trained in pure theorizing and not as technically skilled in econometrics and so. The same thing is true even more with experimental economics, which is often regarded by younger economists as something new and something changing there that happened, which is even sometimes criticized, or at least some of the older economists were quite skeptical about if this is a proper way to do economics. Yeah, so here is a quote from an interview with an older professor of economics. He says that if you ask an economist, what model do you use? They will tell you that I use the basic micro model. But if you ask a sociologist, economic historian, or a political scientist, what model do you use? They may reply, well, I use this particular model, but my colleague has another model, and those in Umeå and Uppsala have something completely different. So here is a great example of boundary work. So being asked about what economics is, you get this contrast to sociology, economic history, political science as something that is not us, and have a lack of this unity of models. So he continues, you in fact have a much greater lack of discipline, theoretical discipline in other subjects. That's what I find attractive with economics. It's the same textbook in Stockholm as in Sydney or Santiago de Chile or any other place. We have this strong central body of theory. The more you move out from that, the more controversy you get. So here you can see both the sort of the value of this discipline and the theoretical core, and also the notion that this core leads to consensus, and if you don't have consensus, you get controversy, and that's something where you don't want to go. Yeah, just another brief interview quote here about heterodox economics. I need to quit after that, I think. This is another economics professor at another university. When I asked him about how he understood the concept of heterodox economics, he said, "I don't know," and laughed. "Heterodoxy was your term, and it made me think about some shady types who hate mainstream economics while themselves being distinguished economists that write a lot. And that doesn't exist. On the other hand, there are perhaps a lot of journalists or such that write about economics. Perhaps there is, I don't know." So this is, I mean, this is a very stark and somewhat ironic example by this person, but it shows how critique or heterodoxy in this case is made invisible or not recognized as existing. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much. Really great presentation. I will be at the computer taking questions also and trying to save them. And we can take questions for the room. Since there's this mic problem, maybe we can try to repeat the question for the people who are online. If you don't mind, that would be
absolutely.
Super. Okay, great. Thank you. Any questions from the room? Sasha?
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting presentation. And I have like a lot of different questions. And perhaps, yeah, going a bit beyond your specific focus interviews. And actually related to this last quote, I was wondering in terms of the kind of heterodoxy, broadly speaking, and the kind of interest that we can see in the Google search and so on. I mean, how much of this is really in this kind of philosophy of science debates on different methodologies? And so how much is really political? I'm asking because as Austrian economics, and Austrians are, well, they are methodologists, but that's the only factor that plays in there. But there are free market people, and the neoclassicals would be considered free market people, and the heterodox gang, broadly speaking, would see themselves against this kind of free market fundamentalism. Some people are saying Austrians is neoclassical. Mark Bloch and so on, some historians of thought would classify Austrians as neoclassical or mainstream. Even though methodologically they're quite big difference. So how much is there actually politics behind it? Not really.
Yeah. So I should try to summarize the question. So Sasha's question was basically how much is there politics between heterodox economics and more than methodological or styles of reasoning. So it's more like a political movement than that. And you exemplify with Austrian economics that some people would classify as neoclassical or mainstream, but others definitely not. Thank you for a very good question. I think there is definitely an extent of politics behind it. I mean, you mentioned initially in your question also my Google Ngrams diagram showing the rise of heterodox economics and whether that's only an effect of the methodological discussion, what we see there. So I will try to tackle that first. I think that heterodox economics has been rising as a term that people use to talk about this internationally, but I think Sweden is an exception to that. And that's where I think we come in. I think, to put it very briefly, I think that the existence of economic history as such a big discipline in Sweden is some sort of valve that makes people who are interested in economic topics able to pursue them in economic history. And if you have a disciplinary belonging, you don't need to start fighting with economists and whether I have some sort of heterodox approach. You just do what you want to do, right? So I think this sense of heterodoxy comes from countries where there is a field that you can't pursue the type of research that you want to pursue. So that's one part of it. But we should also be clear that this is the use of a identifying label, and it's also a narrative by a lot of the history of heterodox economics is written by Frederick Lee, who was also one of the main proponents. So he both wrote his own movement's history and argued about this theoretical integration that we are starting to come together as heterodox economists. So you should take that with some pinch of salt, definitely. When it comes to politics, yes, there is definitely an aspect of it. But I mean, you can argue, heterodox economists argue that there is a lot of politics in neoclassical economics as well, that it's sort of shaped by an value-laden outlook on society and so on. But I think what's interesting with heterodox economics and the attempts to unify, like you have ecological economics and feminist economics and Marxists and evolutionary institutional economics, and also Austrians. I mean, I know that some heterodox authors, they see Austrian economics as somehow an outsider, but still want to include it in a heterodox camp. So I think there is some sort of politics, but it's not like a clear political program or so. But yeah, so values definitely play into it. But I think we should be clear that values play into a lot of social science. It's sort of, it has to do somehow. Thank you.
I get curious now that you've been embedded in do you have any observations on our boundary work?
Yeah. Okay, so
how do you see us from the outside?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. Erik asked, now that I'm in an economic history department, how do I view economic history from the outside, from outsider within position? What's the boundary work going on here? Well, I would say, first of all, that my impressions are quite limited. I mean, it's limited to this department and to, small talk with colleagues and so on.
The world's biggest department in history.
Yeah, that's super cool. No, I was super amazed. I remember the first seminar in this series when we talked about the subject. I'm both puzzled and amazed by the environment here, because I think it's very much characterized by pluralism and openness. I mean, the type of values that heterodox economics tend to pursue. I haven't talked about pluralism a lot, because parallel to the rise of heterodoxy are also people who use the term pluralism. And there's this debate, should we talk about pluralist economics or heterodox economics? Pluralism is like less political or less sort of movement building, more open maybe. But I know that's the view I can see, that it's quite pluralist. I haven't seen, I can't say that I have seen anything that I have analyzed, hobby analyzed in terms of boundary work.
You would have like small notebooks of gossip.
Yeah, I have, no, but I've been thinking more maybe about in terms of styles of reasoning, and the use of quantitative data, statistical style of reasoning, and so on, and how influential it has become. I was a student here at the department many years ago, and I remember the discussions about cliometrics and change in the discipline and so on. And now when I came back, I see that it has really taken off. But I can also see that, well, it was one of the points that I didn't really get to. The concept of styles, to me, it's quite interesting because it allows you to see how, for example, some of my informants, they sometimes talked about colleagues who are definitely studying economic topics, but would be using, for example, narrative theory, which couldn't be formalized in a model, or qualitative interviews or qualitative data about institutions. And distance themselves, drawing boundaries against that. While at the other hand, people were collaborating with epidemiologists. Someone talked about collaborations or closeness to biologists. Someone who was modeling the behavior of Drosophila, like fruit flies, using similar models to economics, and it was like super easy to understand. And I think that's a really nice way to see that it's not always about the closeness of the field you're in, but the more basic approaches. If you are used to working with a certain way of modeling behavior, for example, you can apply that to any other field and the models can travel. The same thing with statistical data, for example. So you can see that it's both a way to close boundaries, but it's also a way that boundaries can become porous and that you can collaborate in interdisciplinary collaborations. But then you also have the interesting question when it creates boundaries, it creates like dominant ideas of what good science is that would exclude another approach.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the choice of style as 75 points in your presentation. And I'm curious to know, it seems like there's this kind of two decision patterns. One would be kind of standardizing, also with a certain notion that it's more efficient, and that you actually kind of get in the field in a more rigorous way, because you sort of get in something that's much like bounded and sort of cool. And another type of like choice that would be heterodox, so then you kind of go away from this. So choosing that is not necessarily as much maybe a process of socialization per se inside of academic space, but maybe outside. So you mentioned this kind of formative experience.
Mm.
Is this too simplistic to say that or like generalizing thing like, okay, the heterodox, they have life experience that then allow them to choose another way of reasoning, and the mainstream would kind of just standardize in?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's very hard if you start thinking about individual persons, but because then you become a psychologist. Like, what's the original motive for searching, becoming part of a reading group in different topics or so on. But yeah, somehow I think that, I mean, pluralism in any sense presupposes exposure to broader experiences, right? So in order to be able to make choices, I mean, you may want to stay with the dominant mainstream or core or whatever, but in order to make choices, you need to be aware of what you can choose between. So definitely, I think that the presupposition for pluralism is some sort of broader exposure. But then, yeah, in my experience, and I didn't mention that, but I've been involved in another project following up this thesis, where we also interview Scandinavian economists on quality notions and quality evaluations and so on. It's very much related to this. But in my view, economists tend to be, I mean, they know a lot about optimization and efficiency and competition and so on. And they tend to apply that to their own discipline and their own career strategies and so on. And I mean, you can be. I was very critical. I mean, my entry point in this was a sympathy for heterodox economics, but I've tried to take in like a methodological symmetry principle, as we call it in sociology of science. So not taking any stances and trying to understand what causes actors to act the way they do. And I mean, I definitely understand reasoning from their point of view, the efficiency of not focusing on too much things, that you need to focus on exactly one thing to be really good at it. So that's sort of a choice. But you can't make that choice if you don't have any alternatives.
I have a question. You mentioned the formation of a kind of scientific habitus. Talk very briefly about how that boundaries work, and sort of, not only the training of people, but also maybe sort of the reproduction of scientific departments, and I think that leads into publications, and just that general idea of like the reproduction of certain strategies and things like that. So my question is whether you identify that this reproduction is related to hiring and funding decisions and things of that. When you compare sort of mainstream versus heterodox economics.
Yes. So the question was basically, the question is the reproduction of the discipline, habitus formation, quality judgment also related to hiring and funding decisions and so on? That was a very brutal summary of the question. I would say definitely yes. So in one of the parts that I didn't talk about now, about evaluation of professorships, I think it's, I mean, it's very clear, and it's also quite intuitive that, I mean, a style of reasoning involves conception of what good or proper science is. How should you do like good or excellent science within a discipline? And that, of course, shapes evaluators' judgment when they evaluate applicants in stark competition. Funding decisions I haven't looked at, so I mean, you would think that it would apply similarly there, but I wouldn't say so much about funding decisions actually. Yeah.
So, really interesting presentation, thank you. And for me, coming from a let's call it a mainstream economics background, I studied economics, and I guess some of the quotes you had on the screen before I can recognise, because I sort of think I don't know what mainstream economics is. I don't know what heterodox economics is. There are sort of full palette of different options out there, and I don't know where to necessarily draw the line. But I also wonder how much of this is sort of concentrated within academia versus does this reflect how the economics graduates that come out of universities around the world, to what extent do they also, in whatever work they do, reflect mainstream versus heterodox? Because on the point around you need to be exposed to different ideas, I would have expected that as people go out and work in a range of different professions and in turn encounter other people from other backgrounds, that's the process by which they start exploring other ways of thinking and other ideas.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, graduates come out and they encounter people with different backgrounds and so definitely. But I think I haven't seen very much. I mean, no one is really talking about what happens to economics graduates who don't continue in academia as PhD students. I even had some informants, PhD students, who were they were not heterodox, but they were not fully sort of accepting what this was all about. And also, I mean, the research reality and so on. So they decided to, I mean, economists have a very good labor market, so they just decided to leave academia. So it's a sort of a self-selection process there. But I think for reproduction of the discipline and heterodox economics, the only thing that matters is first academics and people with academic positions that can sort of continue writing and so on. And I think student movements. There are some like journalists and so who are quite influential as well. And of course, editors who allow people to write and so on. But I think the students movements after 2008 have been quite influential because they put pressures on movement, like senior scholars who feel that, oh, we have people in our back who think they was the same way and ask us to give lectures and so on. I have heard accounts from the UK where pressure from students to teach like some pluralist course or something like that has led to hiring decisions that we need to hire someone who can teach like institutional economics, which means that, oh, we can all of a sudden they can hire someone who wouldn't be hired otherwise. So I think that puts a bit of pressure, but yeah, we'll see how it affects the discipline in the long term. I think but as I've understood, the graduates who work outside academia doesn't seem to be much talked about. I mean, of course, people are happy that people do good careers and do important stuff and so, but it doesn't seem to feed back as much as I understand.
The last question.
One thing I have been thinking about recently is, there's like some kind of, well, perhaps economics is too much for the extreme in terms of theoretical discipline. As like there's one theory, and in that war, you are somehow squeezed out by attrition, and you survive doing a PhD. First, and you'll never get into that because you can't publish. But then on the other hand, if you say, like, for example, here in Sweden, in the economic history, you have to, wherever a heterodox person can go, and like many people, and then they talk somehow about the economy, but it's very perhaps a bit too much into the lack of theoretical discipline as, just using theories to understand stuff. And you have the economic history where sometimes you're not so sure, talking just using basic economics, like talking about what the wage formation, price formation, how these things kind of impact each other, that people actually understand. You who are, senior economic historians, that, and is there somehow, can, this kind of heterodoxy or pluralism go too extreme where perhaps there's not any kind of economic theory left? When you talk about economic stuff, perhaps you use statistics, you come up with some kind of theory afterwards, but it doesn't really make much sense in some kind of, from an economic perspective, perhaps like this minimal consensus that I think a lot of people can probably agree. I mean, actually, say that orthodox economics gets worse, the more advanced it gets, but the kind of basic microeconomics is probably quite agreed upon by many people. Can it go? Now, is there a lack of, perhaps, in economic history, say, of sticking to some theories or knowing at least is there a threat if you want to make economics more pluralist? That this also happens where you say, then you get an economics degree and you have so much, here's some Marx, and I did some post-Keynesian introduction, and then I was reading some Austrians, and I did some feminist things and read Cartolani as well, and then you don't know basic micro with your economics degree. Now, this has been arguments that the profession has been making, especially against pluralism in the undergraduate level, that you need this focus to understand the core, and then you can go on. Like, is there such a...
Yeah, I think it's a very, very good and very relevant general question, which is not only about economics or economic history. So, I mean, the problem is basically how can you find unity in pluralism? Somehow, do you end up like Babel's Tower and everyone talks past each other, which is the image you get from economists sometimes. But I think that's a general problem for all, I mean, all the interdisciplinarity and so that we have today, and sort of pluralism and so. That of course you get more watered down theoretical core, and people do different stuff and talk past each other. You have fewer people who really understands what you do at depth, and so I wouldn't maybe pass a judgment on what would be right for economic history or any other discipline to do that, but I think personally that there is a tension between, I mean, just as you say, that economics may be one extreme, but on the other hand, you have this sort of caricature that the economists paint, that you have sort of totally watered down, untheoretical. But I think that's a question about values. I mean, not political values, but scientific intellectual values. Because I think as science, as an institution, we can go on doing, as long as someone throws money at us, we can go on doing whatever, even if a lot of us or someone thinks it's bad science, it happens. And I think all of us have examples of scientific fields that we think are like really lousy, but they may not think it. So I think it's the question of what sort of values do you want to hold as a discipline, and where do you want to be on this continuum between core and total pluralisms. Very good.
I think another question, but it can be for after also. But because you have this time span of 25 years where you looked at how people were hired, the hiring process, would you say that there was a change or sort of like logics behind?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the one hand, it's the same type of logics that we see in many fields of science. So 25 years ago, I mean, in the beginning of the period, applications and the reviewers would be from Scandinavian countries. They would be written in Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian. They would include books, like textbooks, popular, like all sorts of materials. People would read the PhD thesis, like, and have a review chapter by chapter of it, and so on. And it was very much this like old school idea of peer review. So it was very much the sort of professional judgment of the professor evaluating another potential professor, saying whether this is good or bad. Later on, you will find that it's only English language journal articles that count. Everything is in English, of course. It's part of internationalization and so on. But it's also turns, I mean, in the early period, evaluators could applaud that someone published in international journals, or good international journals. And that increasingly turns to leading, like, top international journals. And then we have this notion of the top 5 that comes somewhere after the turn of the century. And then in terms of evaluation practices, this is one thing that I make quite a big point of here. In terms of practices of evaluation, journal rankings, which economists are very fond of, they become used as what I call a judgment device. So instead of using this like intuitive judgment and explaining why something is good or bad, we basically put this this grid on top of the applications. No, I don't have them. Yeah, I had an example from an evaluation report showing that. So basically, you can set up a point system and see how many top 1 to 20 do you have, how many top 20 to 50, how many da. And one very important aspect of that is that, I mean, there has been researchers in like research policy, and so they talk about the metric tide, that we have all sorts of evaluative metrics in research. And it's used all over, and people use citations and journal impact factors and rankings and all sorts. Economists seem to almost only use economics journal rankings. So it's not about citations, not about journal impact factor, H index or something like that. It's economics journal rankings. And the thing with them is that since they only rank economics journals, they come with sort of predefined disciplinary boundaries. So we have example of people publishing in like really good general journals, but they count for nothing in the economics journal rankings because it's not an economics journal. So if you don't publish in those high-ranked economics journals, I mean, if you publish in political economy, for example, in the good political science journals, it automatically is sort of out-defined. So that's, I think, a very important development. So that's basically this other project that I was involved in. We're working on a paper on the top 5. But there's also starting a discussion in economics about sort of the problem with relying too much on top journal rankings and stuff. I don't know if you're familiar with this paper, The Tyranny of the Top 5. Yes.
Is there publishing stuff that's purely theoretical with 0 applications more than 1?
Yeah.
It was like whatever 10% or something of the research, but it's increasing.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the people online. Sorry for the technical issue, and thank you to you for adjusting to repeating the question and everything. And it's kind of also leads well to the next seminar, because it will be about a Marxist way of thinking inside of economic history. So that will be with Tujan Touraj Fajan. Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.